Hi, my name is Dorothy, and I want to tell you something that happened to me not so long ago. Something that still makes my hands tremble a little when I think back on it, even now that everything is settled and I'm sitting safely in my own home, in my own kitchen, with my tea getting cold on the counter the way it always does when I start talking and forget to drink it. My own daughter, the child I raised, the one I held in my arms the first day of her life and loved in a way that rewired something fundamental inside me, tried to take my home away from me. Not in a loud or dramatic way, not with fighting or threats or any of the things you might picture when you hear a sentence like that. She did it quietly, professionally, almost, with paperwork and appointments and gentle little phrases like, "What's best for you, Mom?" and "I've thought this through carefully," and "You don't need to worry about a thing." And then one Tuesday afternoon in October, I came around the side of my house from the backyard, still wearing my gardening gloves, and I saw a for sale sign in my own front yard. And I understood that she had been planning this for a very long time, without ever once telling me. I was standing there with a clump of dried stems in my hand. Stems from the zucchini plants I had been pulling up to prepare the garden beds for winter, and I stood looking at that sign for what felt like a long time. I remember the light that afternoon, low and golden the way October light gets in the Midwest, and how it made the sign look almost pretty, which felt like an insult. I didn't cry right away. I didn't shout. I just stood there and something happened inside me that I don't have a perfect word for. A kind of long, slow closing, like a door you've been keeping open finally swinging shut. I thought to myself, quietly, so this is what I've become to her. Not her mother. Not the woman who built this house into a home over 40 years. A problem to be managed. A piece of property attached to a more valuable piece of property. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where something you had trusted, completely and without question, cracked open and showed you something underneath that you really didn't want to see? I imagine some of you have. I imagine some of you are living in the middle of something like it right now. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please drop a comment below this video and tell me your city, your state, your country. It means so much to me to know you're out there, and if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do it now. It's absolutely free. You just press that button right below this video, and you'll be notified every time I share a new story. Because what I'm about to tell you is something I've never told anyone in full. Not Vera next door. Not my niece Paula. Not my sister in Florida. And I think you need to hear all of it. Let me start where everything really starts, which is the beginning. Because a house is never just a house. A house is the record of a life. And you have to know the life to understand what it meant to lose that house, or what it cost me to keep it. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a woman named Evelyn who cleaned other people's homes for a living, and a father named Carl, who worked the night shift at a rubber plant until his back gave out when I was 14. We were not poor in the way that means hunger or cold, but we were close enough to those things that I understood from an early age that comfort was not something you were handed. You worked for it. You saved for it. You protected it once you had it. My mother used to say, "Dorothy, money is just dried work." I didn't fully understand that when I was young, but I understand it completely now. I moved to a mid-sized city in Indiana when I was 23. With a degree in accounting from a state school I had paid for myself through a combination of scholarships, part-time work, and a stubbornness that my professors found either admirable or exhausting depending on the week. I got a position as a junior bookkeeper at a small manufacturing company, a family-owned business that made industrial fasteners. I stayed there for 31 years. I was not the most ambitious person in that building. I was not the flashiest or the fastest. But I was meticulous, and I was reliable, and I never once fudged a number or cut a corner. And those things matter more in accounting than people often think. I became the head bookkeeper by my late 30s, and I stayed in that role until I retired at 64, with a small pension and a retirement party in the break room, with a sheet cake that said, "We'll miss you, Dorothy," in blue frosting. During those years, I had met Gerald, a quiet and decent man who worked for the county highway department and had a gift for fixing things around the house and an absolute inability to find anything in the refrigerator without asking me where it was. We were married for 38 years. We were not, either of us, people who expressed love loudly or dramatically. We expressed it in other ways, in the way he always warmed up my car on cold mornings without being asked, in the way I made sure his work clothes were always ready the night before, in the thousands of small acts of consideration that accumulate over decades into something you can't really name except to say it was the foundation of your whole life. When Gerald died, 9 years ago, of a heart condition that moved faster than any of us had anticipated, I lost not just a husband, but the person who had been the daily context of my existence for nearly 4 decades. The grief of that is something I won't try to explain here, because it's not really something words can hold. What I will tell you is that I stayed in our house. I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Gerald and I had bought that house in 1987, a 3-bedroom Cape Cod on a quiet street with a sidewalk and a big oak tree in the backyard that was already mature when we arrived, and must be somewhere close to 100 years old by now. We paid $82,000 for it, which we had saved over 10 years in a joint savings account we called the House Fund, and never touched for anything else, no matter what else came up. I remember the day we signed the closing papers, sitting in an office not unlike the one I would find myself in decades later under entirely different circumstances. And Gerald had reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. And I had thought, this is one of the best things I will ever do. I was right. It was. We raised Lydia in that house. She was born 3 years after we moved in, our only child, the one we had waited a long time for. She grew up under that oak tree, had birthday parties in the backyard every June, until she decided she was too old for them, practiced piano in the living room every afternoon for 6 years, brought friends home, brought boys home, eventually brought Brian home. I remember the first time she brought Brian. He was 30, she was 29, and he had the particular confidence of a man who was used to being the most capable person in the room. He wasn't unkind, not then. He shook my hand firmly and said he'd heard so much about me, and he complimented my kitchen. I thought he was a little slick, if I'm honest. But Lydia looked at him the way you look at something you've decided on, and I loved my daughter, so I decided to see the best in her choice. They married. They had 2 children, James and Mira, who I adored and babysat and took to the zoo and taught to make biscuits on Saturday mornings when Lydia and Brian needed weekends to themselves. I drove 40 minutes each way for those visits. I drove 40 minutes each way for school plays and soccer games, and Mira's ballet recital where she forgot the second half of the routine and improvised magnificently, and I was so proud I nearly knocked the woman next to me off her folding chair. I was present. I was involved. I was, I believe, exactly the kind of grandmother I had always hoped to be. After Gerald died, I thought for a while that Lydia and I were growing closer. She called more often. She came by more. She helped me sort through Gerald's things, which was a task I couldn't have managed alone, not emotionally. There were evenings when we sat at the kitchen table with old photographs and cried together, and those evenings felt real to me, felt like the kind of intimacy that grief sometimes creates between people who love each other. I was grateful. I held on to that gratitude. I would continue holding on to it for longer than I should have, because it blinded me to the gradual change that was happening underneath. The way groundwater can shift beneath a foundation for years before the cracks appear in the walls. If this story is already speaking to something in your own experience, if you felt that slow, quiet disillusionment that comes when someone you love reveals themselves to be something different than you believed, please take a moment right now and hit that subscribe button. It's free. It costs you nothing but one small click, and it means I can keep sharing stories like this one. There are so many people out there who've been where I've been and who've never heard someone say it out loud. I want to be that voice. Please let me. The conversation that started all of this, happened on a Sunday afternoon in late spring, about 2.5 years before I saw that for sale sign in my yard. Lydia and Brian had come for lunch. I had made a roast chicken and a salad and a lemon cake from a recipe I've used since the 1980s. Brian drove up in a newer car, dark green and very clean, the kind of car that announces that its owner is doing well. Lydia was wearing a linen blazer and trousers that I recognized as expensive without being able to name the label. They were doing well. Brian had been in commercial real estate for many years and had, by his own description, been having a strong few years. I didn't begrudge them their success. I was genuinely glad for them. After lunch, over coffee, Lydia said she wanted to talk about something she had been giving a lot of thought to. She said it in a very measured, careful way, the way you speak when you've rehearsed something. She said she and Brian had been discussing estate planning, and that they thought, in the interest of simplicity and avoiding complications, it would make a great deal of sense to transfer my house into her name now, while I was healthy and everything was uncomplicated. She said probate could be a nightmare, that she'd seen it happen to a colleague's family, that it had taken years and cost a fortune. She said she just wanted to protect me and make things easier for everyone. Brian nodded throughout in that particular way he has, not saying much, just confirming with his presence that this was a sound, business-like idea. I held my coffee cup, and I listened to her, and I felt something, a small thing, hard to name. Not fear, exactly. Not suspicion. More like a low vibration, the kind you feel in the floor sometimes before you identify the source of the sound. I said I would think about it. Lydia said, of course, no rush at all, just something to consider. Brian said it was really just a formality at this stage of life, and that they wanted to take the burden off me. A formality. I have thought about that word many times since. I spent several weeks thinking about it. I mentioned it to Vera, my neighbor, who said her son had arranged something similar with her condo, and it had been entirely uneventful. I thought about the months after Gerald died, the paperwork, the county offices, the death certificates required in triplicate for every account, every institution. I had been navigating grief while also navigating bureaucracy, and I remembered how exhausted and alone that had felt. I didn't want Lydia to go through that. She was my daughter. The house would go to her eventually anyway, and I trusted her. I trusted her the way you trust someone you brought into the world and raised with your own hands, which is to say, completely. I called her and told her I had decided to do it. She was warm on the phone, said she loved me, said I was making the right decision, said she would take care of everything. She arranged an attorney, made the appointment, told me what to bring. I drove myself to the office on a Thursday morning. The attorney was professional and efficient. He explained the deed transfer in clear language. I signed where I was told to sign. I initialed where I was told to initial. I walked out into the parking lot afterward and sat in my car for a moment, and I remember thinking I felt relieved. I had done something responsible. I had made my daughter's life easier. I had spared her a future headache. I went home and made myself lunch and felt, if not exactly happy, at least settled. What I did not understand in that parking lot, and what I would spend the next 2 years slowly and painfully coming to understand, was the difference between a daughter who loves her mother and wants to make things easier for her and a daughter who has looked at her mother's life and performed a quiet, careful calculation. Those two things can look identical for a very long time, especially when you are 72 years old and you've spent your whole life giving your family the benefit of the doubt, because that's what love looked like in the home you grew up in. That's what your mother taught you it was supposed to look like. The first thing I noticed in the months after the transfer was that the visits became less frequent. Not dramatically, not all at once. Before, Lydia had come every 2 or 3 weeks. After, it stretched to once a month, then 6 weeks, then longer. She always had reasons. Work was demanding. The kids had things on weekends. Brian had a project that required his attention. Every reason was entirely reasonable, but the texture of the visits, when they did happen, had shifted in a way that was harder to articulate but just as real. There was a new quality to the way Lydia moved through my house, a certain stillness in her attention when she walked through rooms, like someone taking an inventory. She moved a ceramic pitcher I kept on the dining room sideboard, a piece of blue and white pottery I had bought at a craft fair with Gerald years ago, just to see how it looked on the windowsill. She didn't ask. She assessed. She rearranged. She made small comments about what might be updated and what was showing its age. She had also begun to refer to the house differently in conversation. Not your house, Mom, or your home. It was the property now, sometimes. Or the house on Clement Street. Once on the phone, she said, "my house," and then caught herself and said, "I mean the house." But by then I had already heard it, and the hearing of it sat in my chest like a small, cold stone. Then came the condescension. It is remarkable how effective condescension can be when it's dressed up as concern, when the person delivering it genuinely seems to believe they're helping. Lydia began to make small comments about my memory. "Mom, are you sure you took your blood pressure medication today? You seem a little foggy." "Mom, I worry about you driving at night. Your reaction times aren't what they were." "Mom, maybe you shouldn't be up on a ladder cleaning the gutters. Call someone for that." I was not foggy. My reaction times were fine. I had been cleaning my own gutters since 1987. But she said these things with such evident, sincere-seeming concern that I found myself second-guessing myself in a way I never had before. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening after a visit in which she had made 4 separate comments implying some form of decline, and I thought, with a genuinely cold fear, is she seeing something I can't see? Am I losing something and not aware of it? That fear, manufactured by someone I loved out of material that wasn't real, is something I don't think I've ever forgiven entirely. Because what she was doing, even if she didn't fully know she was doing it, was undermining the ground I stood on, softening me up, making me feel smaller and more dependent and less capable than I was, so that when the moment came to move me along, I would offer less resistance. Brian had begun coming on visits more regularly, which hadn't been his habit in earlier years. He had always been pleasant and cordial, but he was a man who made it clear that the world of domestic visits and family lunches was a place he passed through rather than inhabited. Now he was present more often, and his presence had a different quality. He walked the perimeter of the backyard once, hands in his pockets, not saying much. He stood at the kitchen window and said the neighborhood had really come up. He mentioned casually that the lot size was substantial for this area, and that location like this, you'd be surprised what the square footage nets out to. He wasn't saying anything directly to me. He was just thinking out loud, in my house, about the monetary value of the place I had lived in for 38 years. I heard every word. About 14 months after I signed the transfer documents, Lydia sat down across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I had served her thousands of meals, where she had done her homework on 10,000 weekday afternoons, and she told me that she and Brian had been thinking carefully about the future. She said she was worried about me being alone in such a large house. She said the upkeep was a lot for one person. She said she had done some research and found some wonderful options for more manageable living situations. A senior community about 20 miles away that she described as beautiful and very social. An apartment closer to her own neighborhood that was freshly renovated. She said she had already toured one of the places. She had already toured it, without mentioning it to me. She had already gone and looked at a place to put me, and she had come to my table to tell me about it as if she were presenting me with a gift rather than a disposal plan. I asked her if this was about the house. She said it was about my well-being. I looked at Brian, who was standing in the doorway to the hall. He looked at the floor. I said I needed to think about it, and I would get back to her. She said, of course. No rush. but that they were moving forward with some planning, and she wanted to make sure I was part of the conversation. I noticed that she said she wanted me to be part of the conversation rather than the center of it, the person making the decision. After they left that evening, I sat in Gerald's armchair and I turned that phrase over and over in my mind. Moving forward with some planning. Planning that didn't require my input, only my cooperation. Planning that was already in motion regardless of what I said at my own kitchen table. My neighbor Vera came by the next morning with pumpkin bread, as she sometimes does in the fall, and we sat at the kitchen table with our coffee, and I told her what Lydia had said. Vera is a practical woman, a retired nurse, not given to drama. She listened, and then she asked me, very gently, whether I had had my own attorney review the deed transfer before I signed it. Whether I had spoken to someone of my own choosing, independently, before signing the papers that Lydia's arranged attorney had put in front of me. And I sat there with my coffee cup and I thought about it, and I realized I had not. I had walked into a stranger's office, been given documents I didn't fully understand, and signed them because my daughter had arranged everything, and I trusted my daughter. Vera didn't say anything beyond that question. She didn't need to. The question was enough. After Vera left, I went to Gerald's desk, the old wooden one he'd had since before we were married, with its smell of old paper and cedar and something faintly metallic that I have never been able to identify. I opened the bottom drawer and I found the folder where I keep copies of important papers. I sat there reading through the deed transfer documents for a long time. I am not a lawyer, I was a bookkeeper. But I spent 31 years reading documents carefully and noticing when something didn't quite track. And as I read through those pages, I thought about something I had done, about 3 months before Lydia had ever brought up the subject of the title transfer. Something I had done entirely on my own initiative, quietly, because I had gotten a feeling that I couldn't entirely explain even to myself. Something I had tucked away in the back of my mind the way you tuck away a spare key somewhere safe, not because you expect to need it, but because the world is uncertain and you've lived long enough to know that. Let me go back to that, to the thing I had done 3 months before the title transfer, because it's the pivot point of everything. I had been reading an article in a magazine about estate planning and property rights for older homeowners, the kind of article I would have skipped 10 years ago, but found myself reading carefully now that I was past 70. The article mentioned something called a life estate. I had never heard the term before. I read the explanation several times. Then I put the magazine down, and I sat with the idea for a few days. And then I called my doctor's office, not about a medical matter, but to ask for a referral. My doctor was a straightforward and practical woman named Sandra, and I knew she had dealt with real estate matters herself because she had mentioned once buying a rental property, and I asked the receptionist to leave her a message asking if she knew a real estate attorney she trusted personally. Sandra called me back herself that evening and gave me a name, a woman named Helen who had an office downtown. Please, if you're still with me here and this story is landing somewhere real for you, take 1 moment before I go on and subscribe to this channel. It's free. It always will be. Just click the button below. It means I can keep telling these stories, and it means the next story will come to you automatically when it's ready. This is how we do this together. Okay. Helen. I called Helen, made an appointment, and drove downtown on a Wednesday afternoon in early February. Her office was on the 3rd floor of an older building, the kind with slow elevators and good solid woodwork, and the feeling that serious things have been decided in its rooms over many decades. Helen herself was a woman in her mid-50s, precise and calm, with a way of listening that made you feel like she was hearing not just what you said, but everything around what you said. I told her I was thinking about transferring my house to my daughter, and I wanted to understand what that would mean for me. I told her I wanted to know what protections existed, if any, for someone in my position. She explained several mechanisms to me. She explained the difference between a straightforward deed transfer, a transfer on death deed, a trust, and what she called a retained life estate. When she got to the life estate, she explained it in plain language. A life estate is a clause that can be recorded directly in the property deed before any transfer takes place. The clause establishes, as a matter of public record, that the person named in it, the life tenant, has the legal right to live in and use the property for the entirety of her natural life. She cannot be evicted. She cannot be displaced. Her right to occupy the property is senior to any subsequent ownership interest, and critically, any sale of the property requires her signature. Without her consent and her written release of the life estate, no sale can proceed with clean title. The person who holds the deed can own the property on paper, but they cannot sell it, cannot force the life tenant out, and cannot convey it free and clear to a buyer without the life tenant's cooperation. I listened to all of this very carefully. I asked her several questions. I asked what would happen if my daughter wanted to sell, and I didn't want her to. I asked what would happen if there was a legal dispute. I asked how much it would cost to record the life estate, and how long it would take. Helen answered every question. The process was not complicated and not expensive. The clause would be drafted, notarized, and recorded with the county recorder's office. From that point, it would be a matter of public record, searchable by any competent title search. If someone later tried to sell the property, the title company handling the sale would find the life estate in the course of their mandatory title search, and the sale would not be able to close without my signature releasing it. I went home and thought about it for a week. I thought about Lydia, who had not yet mentioned anything about a title transfer. I thought about my own situation, 72 years old, alone in a house I had spent my whole working life paying for and maintaining. I thought about the magazine article. I thought about the low vibration I sometimes felt when I looked at things clearly and let myself think about what they might mean. I called Helen back and said I wanted to do it. She prepared the documents. A title company recorded the life estate clause in the property deed. I paid Helen's fee, which was far less than I had expected. I took my copies home, folded them carefully, and put them in the folder in the bottom drawer of Gerald's desk, right behind the folder with the original deed from 1987. And then I closed the drawer and I didn't think about it again for 3 years. 3 months later, Lydia brought up the title transfer. I agreed. The life estate was already on record. I need to tell you about the afternoon I saw the for sale sign, because the detail of it matters to me. It was a Tuesday in mid-October, 2 years and 4 months after I had signed the transfer documents. I had been in the backyard working since about 2 in the afternoon, pulling up the spent vegetable plants, turning over the soil in the beds, adding compost. I do this every October. I have done it every October since 1989. The backyard in October has a particular smell, cold earth and dry leaves and something faintly sweet that I've never identified precisely, but that means autumn to me in a way nothing else does. The oak tree was at its peak that week, its leaves a deep reddish-brown, with the last of the afternoon light coming through them in a way that made the yard look almost amber. I came around the side of the house through the gate, carrying an armful of dried zucchini stems, and I saw it. A real estate sign, one of those large ones that go into the ground on a metal frame, in my front yard near the sidewalk. The name of the agency was one I recognized from signs I had seen in other yards over the years. The phone number was printed in large numerals. There was a QR code in the corner. I stood there and I read it several times. The way you sometimes have to read something several times before your brain fully accepts what your eyes are seeing. Earlier that week, on a Thursday afternoon, a car I didn't recognize had pulled into the driveway. A woman had gotten out, professionally dressed, carrying a clipboard with attached papers. Lydia had been there, had met her in the driveway, had introduced her to me as a friend from the neighborhood. I had offered them coffee. They had declined and walked through the house. I thought the woman seemed oddly professional for a casual neighborly visit. She took measurements of the living room. I had thought that was strange, and I had told myself it was something to do with a project Lydia was helping with. I understood now what project that had been. I went inside. I set the stems on the kitchen counter. I took off my gloves. I washed my hands at the sink, and then I stood at the kitchen window and I looked out at the backyard, at the oak tree and the turned-over garden beds and the old wooden arbor that Gerald had built in 1993 and that I repaint every 5 years to keep it from rotting. I stood there for a long time. I was very quiet inside. In that particular way you get quiet when something is too large to feel immediately, when your whole emotional system just takes a moment to recalibrate to the new reality. I called Lydia that evening. She answered on the second ring. I told her I had seen the sign. There was a pause, brief but perceptible, and then she said yes. She and Brian had decided it was the right time. The market was favorable. They had been in contact with an agency for a few weeks. The listing had just gone live. I asked her where she expected me to go. She said she had been looking at the senior community she'd mentioned before, that there was an opening in December, that she thought I would find it really lovely once I settled in. She said it as though my settling in were already decided. I asked whether she had planned to tell me. She said she had meant to bring it up very soon. I asked her to define very soon. The call was short. I said I needed some time to think, and I would call her back. I hung up, and then I sat down in Gerald's armchair. In the living room of the house I had signed over to my daughter because I trusted her, and I let myself feel, for a while, everything I had been not quite feeling for the past several months. It was considerable. I called Helen, the attorney, the next morning. I told her everything, from the beginning, including the conversation about the senior community, and the real estate sign, and the woman with the clipboard who had taken measurements in my living room while I offered her coffee. Helen listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Dorothy, I need you to come in and bring your copies of the life estate documents." I went in on Thursday. It was a gray and cold Thursday. The tree outside her third-floor window that had been brilliant in summer was now almost bare, just a few brown leaves clinging at the very tips of the branches. We sat across from each other at her desk. She reviewed the documents carefully, though she had prepared them herself 3 years before. She confirmed everything. The life estate had been properly drafted. It had been properly recorded with the county recorder's office. The recording number was correct. The date of recording predated the deed transfer by approximately 3 months. Any standard title search conducted as part of a property sale would identify the instrument. And the instrument was unambiguous. The life estate holder, Dorothy Ann Callahan, had the right to occupy and use the property for her natural life, and any conveyance of the property required her written release of the life estate. Without that release, no buyer could take clear title. Then Helen said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "Dorothy, your daughter cannot sell this house without your signature." She said it quietly and directly, without theater. Not legally, not without it. I sat very still for a moment. Then I said, "So if they've already started the sale process, what happens?" She said that the sale could proceed all the way to the closing table. A buyer could be found. Contracts could be signed. Money could be arranged. And at the final closing, when the buyer's attorney or the title company ran the mandatory title search, which is a legal requirement in every real estate transaction, they would find the life estate, and the closing would stop, because a buyer cannot receive clear, insurable title to a property that carries a life estate without a release from the life estate holder. And I was the life estate holder. And I had not released anything, and I had no intention of doing so. I asked Helen what I should do in the meantime. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would advise me not to contact Lydia about the life estate yet, not to call, not to threaten, not to warn. She said to let the sale proceed as far as it was going to proceed, and to be at the closing when it happened. She said she would prepare a clean, certified copy of the recorded life estate documents. She said I should keep them with me. I asked her if she thought there was any risk to my position. She said the document was properly recorded and predated the transfer, and there was no legal basis she could see for challenging it. but that I should not take legal advice from her memory of what she had prepared. I should take it from the documents themselves, which is why she wanted me to have certified copies. I took those copies home on a Thursday afternoon. I folded them carefully, and I put them in the inside pocket of my gray wool coat, the heavy one I wear in the fall and winter. I kept them there for 4 weeks. Every morning when I put that coat on, I could feel them, folded and firm against my ribs. They were not a weapon. I was not carrying them for any dramatic purpose. I was carrying them because they were the truth, in document form, and because the truth, when you've been dismissed and managed and quietly lied to by people who should have loved you better, becomes something you want to keep very close to your body. During those 4 weeks, I went about my life. I raked the oak leaves. I had Vera over for dinner twice. I baked a batch of oatmeal cookies and brought them to the church where I sometimes volunteer with the food drive. I spoke to Paula on the phone. I called my sister Agnes in Florida and talked to her for an hour about absolutely nothing important, which is a kind of conversation I had begun to treasure more in recent years. I didn't tell any of them about the life estate. I didn't tell anyone. Helen had advised me to be quiet, and I was quiet. But I was not afraid, and I want to be clear about that. I was sad. I was grieved in a way that was different from any grief I had experienced before, because it was a grief about a living person who had made choices, not about a loss beyond anyone's control. But I was not afraid. For the first time in 2 years, since those visits had started shifting and those comments had started accumulating, I was not afraid. Lydia called me twice during those 4 weeks with what she called updates on the timeline. She had found buyers, a couple in their mid-30s who were pre-approved and eager. The closing was scheduled for a Friday in mid-November. She said this in a business-like tone that reminded me uncomfortably of how Brian used to describe his commercial projects. She said she wanted to coordinate with me about the senior community, which had that December opening she'd mentioned. She said she had gone ahead and held the spot because she didn't want me to lose it. She had gone ahead and held a spot for me in a place I had never agreed to go to, with a deposit she had presumably paid from the account she now controlled. I thanked her politely and said I would be at the closing. She said that wasn't necessary. I said I would be there anyway. The closing was on a Friday morning in mid-November. I wore my gray wool coat. I arrived at the title company's offices 12 minutes early. The building was warm, one of those older office buildings that overheats in winter as if in compensation for the cold outside. The conference room had a long table, a water pitcher in the center, and chairs with padded seats that might have been comfortable 20 years ago. Brian was already there in a dark suit and a tie I recognized as expensive, the kind of tie that has a small repeated pattern that you only notice when you're close to it. The real estate agent was there, a professional-looking woman with reading glasses on a chain who nodded to me when I came in. 2 attorneys, Lydia's, a man in his early 40s who moved with the confidence of someone who handles many closings and finds them routine, and the buyer's attorney, an older man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a yellow legal pad on the table in front of him. The buyers themselves, a young couple, arrived just after me. They were nervous in the way people are when they're about to sign the largest document of their financial lives. That particular mixture of excitement and controlled anxiety that I remembered from 1987 when Gerald and I had sat in a room not unlike this one. Lydia arrived 5 minutes after I did. She came through the door in a dark blazer and saw me immediately. She stopped for just a fraction of a second. Something moved through her face, and then she composed herself and came in and took a seat across the table, not next to me. The closing began. Documents were distributed. Amounts were reviewed. The buyer's attorney worked through his stack methodically, item by item. Everyone in the room had a role and was executing it. Then the buyer's attorney, the older man with the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, slowed down. He turned back a page. He turned back again. He said, in a voice that was professionally neutral but had gone quiet in a way that made the whole room pay attention, "I need to flag an item here." He said that the title search had returned a recorded instrument. He read the instrument number. He said the instrument was a life estate recorded at the county recorder's office in favor of Dorothy Ann Callahan, dated approximately 3 years prior to the deed transfer listed in the current transaction. He said this instrument had not been disclosed in the seller's disclosures or noted in the listing. He said that as a result, the property could not convey free and clear title to his clients without either a written release of the life estate from the named holder or a legal proceeding to address the encumbrance. The room went still. Not dramatically still, the way it does in a film. Quietly still. The kind of still that falls over a room when everyone present suddenly has to recalibrate what they thought was happening. Brian cleared his throat. The real estate agent set her pen down. The young couple looked at each other and then at the table. Lydia's attorney leaned toward her and said something very quietly. Lydia listened. Then she looked at me. Lydia's attorney said, in a smooth and professional voice, that perhaps this was something that could be addressed directly, that it appeared the life estate holder was present in the room, and that perhaps a release could be obtained today, and the closing could proceed. He gestured toward me minimally, the gesture of a man who has handled hundreds of closings and believes this is a procedural matter that will resolve itself in the next few minutes. Lydia looked at me again. Something in her expression had shifted. She had been startled and then composed, and now there was a different quality underneath the composure. Thin and tight, the look of someone whose plan has encountered an unexpected variable and who is still deciding how to respond. She said, "Mom, the attorney just needs your signature on a release. It's basically a formality at this point." She used the word formality, the same word Brian had used 2.5 years ago in my kitchen when he described the title transfer. I reached into my coat pocket. I took out the folded papers, the certified copies of the recorded life estate that I had been carrying against my ribs for 4 weeks, and I unfolded them and laid them flat on the table in front of me. I said, "I had this recorded 3 years ago." I said it quietly. I did not raise my voice. My voice was, I think, completely steady. I said, "This is a life estate in my favor, recorded before the deed was transferred into my daughter's name. It gives me the right to live in this property for the rest of my life, and it requires my signature for any sale to close." I paused. Then I said, "I'm not going to sign." The buyer's attorney picked up his copy of the instrument, though he had clearly already read it during his title review. He confirmed to his clients, slowly and clearly, that the instrument was genuine, properly executed, and properly recorded. He said the closing could not proceed today. He said he would need to consult with his clients about next steps. The young couple, to their credit, remained calm. They were disappointed, visibly, but they were calm. Lydia asked me, in a voice I had not heard from her before, very controlled, very deliberate, "Mom, do you understand what you're doing?" I said yes, I did. I understood exactly what I was doing. I was declining to sign away the right to live in my own home. She said she thought we could talk about this privately and work something out. I said there was nothing to work out. She said she was trying to do what was best for me. I said what was best for me was to remain in my home, which I had every legal right to do. I want to tell you something true about that moment, because from the outside, if you had been watching, it might have looked like a victory. And in legal and practical terms, it was exactly that. But sitting at that table with my certified copies in front of me and my daughter's face across the table, watching the color change in her face, and the composure becoming effortful rather than natural, I was not feeling triumph. I was feeling grief. Because what I was reading in her face in that moment was not love overcoming calculation. It was not remorse. It was not the look of someone who had just realized she had gone wrong and wanted to find her way back. It was the look of someone who had been outmaneuvered and was already thinking about what came next. And that was the final piece of information I needed, the piece I had been hoping wouldn't be true. The piece that told me who my daughter had decided to be, and when she had decided it. I stood up. I thanked the buyer's attorney for his thoroughness. I turned to the young couple and I said I was very sorry for their trouble, and I hoped they found a wonderful home. I did not speak to Brian. I did not speak to Lydia's attorney. I gathered my papers, folded them carefully, and put them back in my coat pocket. I shook hands with the buyer's attorney. And I walked out of that conference room and out through the lobby and out into the November air, which was cold and gray and smelled like wood smoke from somewhere nearby. I sat in my car for a few minutes without starting it. There was a crow on a telephone wire across the parking lot, sitting absolutely motionless. I watched it for a while. Then I drove home. I want to say something to you right now, if you've come this far with me. If you've spent this time listening and any of this has felt familiar, any of it has touched something you've been carrying, please take one moment and subscribe. Just that one click, it's free, and it tells me that you're here, and it allows me to keep doing this. Because there is so much I have wanted to say out loud for a long time, and I am grateful, deeply grateful, that you are willing to listen. Lydia called that afternoon. I didn't answer. She called again in the evening. I didn't answer. She sent a text that said, "Mom, we need to talk about this. Please call me." I read it and set my phone on the counter and made myself a bowl of vegetable soup from the pot I'd had simmering all day, and I sat at my kitchen table and ate it. Brian sent a message, the first direct message he had ever sent me in all the years he had been my son-in-law, that said, "Dorothy, let's find a way to resolve this reasonably." I read that one too. Then I set the phone face down and finished my soup and washed the bowl and dried it and put it back in the cabinet. Over the following days, there were more calls and messages. Lydia came by one afternoon unannounced, which she hadn't done in a very long time, and knocked at the door. I answered it. She came inside and we sat in the living room and she talked for a long time. She used many words. She talked about how she had been worried about me, how the house was too much for one person, how she had only been trying to look ahead and protect me. She said things like, "I thought I was doing the right thing, and I didn't realize you felt this way, and I never meant to hurt you." What she did not say, not once, was, "What I did was wrong." She did not say, "I was trying to take your home." She did not say, "I am sorry." She offered explanations, which are not the same as apologies. She offered context, which is not the same as accountability. I listened to all of it. When she was finished, I said, "I hear you, and I need more time." She left. I sat with the silence of the house for a while after she was gone, and I thought about the difference between a relationship and the memory of one. The week after the closing, I called Helen and told her I wanted to update my estate documents. Not from anger. I want to be clear about that. What I felt when I made that call was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was clarity. The kind of clarity that is a gift, if an expensive one. Because the whole experience had given me, underneath all the grief and the disillusionment, an absolutely clear picture of who was present in my life and who had been present. Not for what they might get someday, but simply because they loved me and wanted to be here. I thought about my niece Paula. Paula is Lydia's cousin, the daughter of my late brother Henry. She is 48 years old, and she works as a nurse administrator at a hospital 45 minutes from my house. Every other month she drives here just to have lunch with me. She doesn't call it an obligation. She calls it catching up. She calls on my birthday, and she remembers things I said in passing 2 visits ago, and she asks about them the next time. She asks about the garden. She sends me cards from trips she takes, actual paper cards with handwriting on them. She has never once, in all the time I have known her, walked through my house with that particular stillness of assessment. She has never made a comment about what the neighborhood is worth. She has never, not once, made me feel like a problem to be managed. Helen drew up new documents. The house, when I'm gone, will go to Paula. There is a bequest to the food pantry at St. Anthony's, where Gerald used to volunteer on Saturday mornings for 15 years. There is a provision covering my care costs should I ever need assistance. Everything is properly structured, witnessed, notarized, and filed. Lydia and Brian will receive nothing from my estate. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I don't want it to sound like punishment and I don't want it to sound like rage, because it is neither of those things. It is simply the natural consequence of choices made. When you choose to treat your mother as a resource to be liquidated, you have already made a decision about the future of the relationship, whether you understand it in those terms or not. Consequences are not cruelty. They are just what comes next. Helen also walked me through the situation going forward, the life estate, and what it meant for the longer term. My right to remain in my home was secure for my lifetime, legally and documented. She explained what would happen to the property after I was gone, how the life estate would dissolve and the property would pass according to my updated will, to Paula, who has said she would like to keep it, that it feels like family history to her, which it is. Helen explained that Lydia could theoretically attempt to challenge the life estate legally, but that the challenges available to her were narrow and expensive and unlikely to succeed, given the documentation. Lydia has, as of today, taken no legal action. I believe she consulted her own attorney and received honest advice about the strength of her position. The oak tree lost its remaining leaves in November, which it always does all at once over about 4 days, as if it simply decides one morning that it's done. I raked them up on a Saturday, and Vera came over and helped me for a couple of hours, and then we had tea on the back porch even though it was cold enough that we both kept our coats on. She asked me how I was doing, and I said honestly that I was doing better than I expected. She said she was glad. She didn't ask for details and I didn't offer them. We drank our tea and watched a pair of juncos moving through the bare branches of the oak. And Vera told me about her grandson's soccer team, and I told her about the recipe I was planning to try from a library cookbook I had checked out the week before. It was a very ordinary afternoon. It was one of the best afternoons I have had in a long time. Lydia and I have spoken 3 times since the closing. The first time was the visit I described, where she talked for a long time without saying she was sorry. The second was a phone call about 6 weeks later, shorter, where she seemed to be testing whether my position had softened. It had not. The third was at Christmas, which was careful and surface and organized around the children, who are not responsible for any of this, and who I love without reservation or condition. James showed me a project he was working on for school, and Mira taught me a card game she had learned from a friend, and those 2 hours with my grandchildren were the easiest I had spent since before all of this started. Children are very good at existing in the present tense. Adults could learn from that. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with Lydia. I have stopped trying to predict it, which has brought me a kind of peace. What I know is that the door is not locked. I'm not a woman who locks doors. If she comes to me someday with something genuine, not with a new version of the same framing where she was practical and I was fragile and everything made sense in her version, but with honest words about what she chose and why, I will listen. I will cry. I am certain I will cry. And I will find a way to begin again with her, because she is my daughter, and I am her mother, and those facts are not undoable. But I will not run toward her. I am 74 years old, and I am done running toward people who walk away. My house is quiet in the evenings. I have come to love that quiet, really love it, in a way I wasn't sure I would when the silence first settled in after Gerald died. I make dinner and eat it at the kitchen table with a book or the radio on. I sit in Gerald's armchair and read or watch something I want to watch, not something I've been told to watch. I talk to Vera over the back fence sometimes when we're both in the yard. Paula calls every Sunday evening, without fail. There is a cardinal who comes to the feeder outside my kitchen window every morning, a male with the most impossibly brilliant red feathers, and I have developed over this past year a real and serious affection for that bird. These are small things, but they are not small to me. They are the texture of a life that is mine, that has always been mine, that no one is going to take from me. I want to say something to you before I go, and I want to say it directly, because I think you deserve directness. If you are older, if you own your home, if someone in your family has started talking to you about your property, your estate, what will happen when you're gone? What would be easier for everyone? I want you to hear me clearly. Find your own attorney. Not one they found, not one they arranged. One you found yourself, through your own channels, someone you spoke to alone without anyone listening at the door. Ask them about your situation. Ask them what protections exist for people in your position. Ask about life estates, about trusts, about transfer on death deeds, about all the instruments that exist to protect people like us. It will cost less than you fear, and it will be worth more than you can quantify. Do not sign documents you don't understand. Do not let the warmth in someone's voice or the love you feel for them prevent you from asking the hard questions. You worked for what you have. You earned it over decades of careful, diligent, sometimes exhausting effort. That matters. You are allowed to protect it. And if you are a child of an older parent, please hear this too. Your parent built something. They built it before you were born, or when you were too young to understand what they were sacrificing. They saved for it. They went without for it. They were careful for years, sometimes decades, so that one day they could stand in a house they owned and feel the particular pride that comes from having built something real. Honor that. Do not assess it. Do not calculate it. Do not walk through their home looking at the square footage and thinking about the market. Sit with them. Ask about their lives. Call when you said you would call. Remember the things they tell you. Those things are not complicated. They are just choices. And your children will one day be watching you make them. There is a sentence I keep coming back to, something I thought to myself in the parking lot of the closing office, standing in the November cold with a crow on the telephone wire. My daughter thought she had taken my house from me. She had the deed. She had the realtor. She had the buyer. She had the closing scheduled. She had the plan. She thought she had handled everything. But it was always mine. It had always been mine. And I had never, not for a single day, forgotten that. Thank you for listening to all of this. I mean that from the very deepest part of my heart. If this story gave you something, if it touched something real, if it reminded you of your own strength, or gave you an idea, or simply made you feel a little less alone in something you're carrying, please share it with someone who might need it. A sister, a neighbor, a friend, anyone you know who's in the middle of something like this and might not know there are options. And please subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. It's free, it's right below this video, and every subscription tells me that what I'm doing here matters, that these stories are worth telling, that you want to hear more of them. I am so grateful for your time and your company. God bless you. Take very good care of yourselves. And please, take care of each other.